When President Lincoln kicked Copperhead leader Clement Vallandigham out of the Union in June 1863, he had troops escort him to Tennessee. From there, Vallandigham made his way to Wilmington, North Carolina. He then began a sea voyage that eventually took him to Halifax, Nova Scotia, by way of Bermuda, the traditional manner that Confederates used to evade the Union blockade and get to Canada. Once he got to Canada, he was treated exceedingly well.
He comes to Canada, and of course, he is feted as a hero.
Julian Schur is a journalist and the author of The North Star, Canada and the Civil War Plots Against Lincoln.
There he'll meet John A. Macdonald, who is Canada's George Washington, the father of Confederation, and Macdonald toasts Vallandigham as a refugee in distress. He's invited as a guest to Parliament, and Vallandigham makes his way to Clifton House, beautiful, sumptuous hotel overlooking Niagara Falls. According to press reports that I uncovered, they would imbibe freely of Canadian whiskey and talk about hanging the abolitionists. And the newspapers were largely in favor of the Confederates, and they praised Vallandigham for his honest advocacy of peace. And they denounced Lincoln as, quote, the mad, blood-stained despot at Washington. And with the kind of gall that only someone on a crusade could really muster, what does he do? He decides to run as governor of Ohio from Canada.
The disgraced former U.S. congressman, exiled from the United States for treasonous speech during a time of war, received the Democratic Party's nomination for governor of Ohio, which by the fall of 1863 had become a hotbed of violent dissent against the U.S. government. Though he lost that election, he quickly pivoted toward a new goal, becoming the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. This is the Copperhead Conspiracy. I'm Dan Gettleman. At the beginning of the American Civil War, Canada was still a colony in the British Empire, and both the United States and the Confederacy very much wanted Britain as an ally.
Well, when the Civil War breaks out, I think Abraham Lincoln and many people in the North hoped Britain would be on their side. After all, Britain had led the world in abolishing slavery. And I think much to their dismay and shock, Britain declares neutrality, which meant automatically that Canada, which was still a colony of Britain, was also neutral. What it meant for Canada, though, is that Canada became a very open legal haven for Confederates. This wasn't secret or hidden. It meant that the Confederates, they could send agents, and rich aristocrats could live in Montreal and Toronto, send back supplies to the South, but also campaign openly for the Southern cause. So I think Jefferson Davis and Lincoln both saw Canada in the same way. But one was very happy. Davis was very happy that Canada was supporting the South. And of course, Lincoln grew increasingly enraged.
All of this begs the question of why Canadians would be so supportive of the South during the Civil War, especially given Canada's reputation as a promised land for those enslaved in the United States.
There were all kinds of reasons why there was a surprising amount of support for the South among the Canadian elites, not among the general population. We know there were no popular opinion polls, but we know that tens of thousands of ordinary Canadians signed up and fought in the Union Army. Many die, some become generals and receive all kinds of medals. But among the Canadian elites, there were several reasons why I don't think they necessarily supported slavery, but they had a sympathy for the aristocratic South. There was a class affinity. Canada, had these British aristocrats, and the Southerners who came up here and established homes were of the same class, the same high bearing, and they bought fancy mansions and went to the same clubs. So you have that class unity, the fellow aristocrats. Second, you had economic reasons. Much like today, oligarchs from Russia have set up themselves in London, and there's a huge market for getting around the sanctions against Russia. Well, during the Civil War, because of the blockade, you could make a fortune from Canada sending all kinds of goods around the blockade to the Confederates, not to mention the Navy shipyards in Halifax. Confederate companies were being traded on the London Stock Exchange. 80% of Britain's cotton came from the South. So there were a bunch of economic reasons to support the South. And also, a lot of the conservative church leaders, the Catholic Church in Quebec. And it's quite appalling because as a Canadian, I grew up, being happy and proud, learning in school that Canada was on the right side of the Civil War, right? The terminus for the Underground Railroad. And when I discovered that leading newspapers praised the assassination of Lincoln, like when Lincoln gets assassinated, Canadian newspapers said it was justified by the facts because Lincoln had murdered the Constitution. So you can see why Canada was such a friendly haven for the Confederates.
So all of this helps to explain why Canada would be considered the logical destination for a growing community of exiled Copperheads, escaped Confederate soldiers, and official representatives of the Confederate government, sent north to begin secret operations against the United States.
In early 1864, the tide is beginning to turn against the Confederates. They're not quite losing yet, but they're not winning anymore. And so Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States, gets the Confederate politicians to secretly vote for a $1 million secret fund to set up what are called the Confederate Secret Services. Most of that money would go to Canada. And Davis named a good friend of his, a man named Jacob Thompson, who was a well-known politician in Washington, knew a lot of people in Lincoln's cabinet, a staunch Southerner, a Mississippi slave owner. He is sent to Canada, first arrives in Halifax, and will eventually settle in Toronto. But first he will come to Montreal, and he will deposit close to $649,000, which is the equivalent today of $12 million, in a branch of the Ontario Bank run by Henry Starnes. Henry Starnes had been the mayor of Montreal for 2 years. He was a sitting member of Parliament, one of the leading English aristocrats, and his bank would become the main money laundering and slush fund operation for Jacob Thompson. And his number two would be Clement Clay. Clement Clay is actually the man who's on the back of the Confederate $1 bill. So Clement Clay will move to St. Catharines, just north of the American border. And from there, he would disperse funds for the various terror plots that the Confederates engaged in.
While Jacob Thompson was in Montreal, he had a series of meetings with people from both the South and the North, learning the lay of the land and figuring out the best ways to invest the $1 million that he'd been given to use. He summarized his activities in a letter to Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell, who were representing the Confederacy in Britain and France.
Gentlemen, the result of the conferences we held at Montreal led me to conclude that Lincoln would be reelected overwhelmingly, and thus there would be continued the present policy of the administration for 4 years more. In discouragement, I went to Windsor, Ontario, where an arrangement had been made with the Honorable Clement Vallandigham. He informed me of the existence in the Western States of an order known as the Sons of Liberty. The membership of the Sons of Liberty is in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, in the aggregate, about 170,000 men. It is proposed by the Northwestern people to take possession of the present organized governments of the 3 states mentioned and organize provisional governments for the purposes in view. It can be, I confidently feel, so arranged that these states shall be organized into a Northwestern Confederacy, with such advantages as will enable them to dictate terms of peace to the United States government. To this end, I am addressing every energy that is practicable and reasonable to assist the Northwestern people, and everything justifies the belief that success will ultimately attend the undertaking. I remain, with great respect, very truly yours, Jacob Thompson.
As we learned in our last episode, the Copperhead uprising discussed by Jacob Thompson and Clement Vallandigham in Ontario would eventually be attempted in late August 1864. But it was originally supposed to happen earlier that year, in mid-June, to coincide with the State Democratic Convention in Hamilton County, Ohio. And it was going to be triggered by a surprise appearance by the exiled Vallandigham, who had represented that district in Congress for 3 terms. The idea was that the Union Army would immediately arrest him for returning to the United States, and that this would so enrage Copperheads throughout the country that they would spontaneously rise up in armed rebellion. And that would then provide cover for the Confederates to spring their soldiers out of Union prisons. But Lincoln wisely decided that this time Vallandigham should not be arrested, precisely so that he would not be seen as a martyr for the Copperhead cause. Once it became clear that he wasn't going to be arrested, the Confederates and their Copperhead allies looked for another opportunity to pull the trigger on their plan. Coordinating all this were Captain Thomas Hines and his second-in-command, Captain John B. Castleman. Castleman wrote about his experiences in a memoir called Active Service. In his telling, it became clear to him, and to Hines, that rather than trying to coordinate the actions of Sons of Liberty members in multiple states, they should concentrate on a large group planning to attend the National Democratic Convention in Chicago at the end of August.
Hines and I were obliged to conclude that a vast number collected in one community offered our only hope. We knew that a large number, at least 50,000 men who were members of the Sons of Liberty, should be gathered at the National Democratic Convention. We advised Commissioner Thompson to accept the expressed opinions of the Sons of Liberty officials, who favored the convention as the occasion for armed hostility to the continuance of a war waged by the sacrifice of the white man's life for the abolition of the black man's slavery.
As part of their preparation, secret communications had been passed to Confederate prisoners at Camp Douglas in Chicago and the prison at Rock Island, Illinois, telling them to be ready for the attacks. Hines and Castleman would lead a force of about 60 Confederate soldiers based in Canada, mostly other Kentuckians who had, like themselves, served under General John Hunt Morgan. They were particularly well equipped for this kind of clandestine warfare. Historian Patrick Lewis.
With these folks in Southern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, they can pass. They have the same dialect. They've got the same idioms. A lot of them are raised in the same types of churches with the same types of theology, right? So they can blend into Midwestern society incredibly easy, and import Confederate arms and money, and potentially launch some really explosive insurrectionary activities with the assistance of Confederate prisoners who are stationed in prison camps all along the Great Lakes.
But unfortunately for Hines and his men, there was embedded within their ranks a Union spy. It wasn't Felix Stidger this time, but someone else who was going to ruin their carefully laid plans for the liberation of their imprisoned comrades. His name was George W. Young, a Confederate officer from Kentucky who had served with distinction as part of Morgan's raiders, escaped from Camp Douglas a year before, and made his way to Canada. At a certain point, perhaps worried that Hines' plans were flawed, Young contacted the Union military commander in Detroit, seeking amnesty as an escaped prisoner. To prove his worthiness, he provided information about an upcoming operation that was planned to coincide with the Chicago Convention. The Detroit commander explained the situation in a message to a fellow Union officer.
I have caused inquiries to be made in Canada about Major Young, and understand that he does possess the confidence of the rebel agents, and that his statements are entitled to respect. He now informs me that he proceeded to Toronto, and that about 200 rebel refugees are assembled at that place, who are armed with revolvers and supplied with funds and transportation tickets to Chicago, and that already 150 have proceeded there. The general plan is to accomplish the release of the prisoners at Camp Douglas, and in doing so they will be assisted by an armed organization at Chicago. After being released, the prisoners will be armed and being joined by the organization in Chicago, will be mounted and proceed to Camp Morton at Indianapolis, and there accomplish a similar object in releasing prisoners.
Armed with this intelligence from the Confederate informant, the Union officers communicated what they knew to the Camp Douglas commander, Colonel Benjamin Sweet. This wasn't the first time Sweet had heard of such plots, but initially he had either dismissed or overlooked them. For example, earlier that year, Army officers in Kentucky had questioned an escaped Camp Douglas prisoner who claimed that anti-war Democrats in Chicago had provided money and horses to escapees. He mentioned a man named Walsh, who lived nearby and whose daughter smuggled messages into the camp. However, Sweet took no action to investigate Walsh or his daughter. But this time, his superiors took the information from the Confederate informant seriously enough to send additional troops to protect Camp Douglas from attack, along with a battery of cannon. One of the key members of the Confederate forces in Chicago, serving under Captain Thomas Hines, was Lieutenant Bennett Young. He sent a report to Confederate Commissioner Clement Clay, explaining what happened next.
In accordance with your orders, I left Canada Friday morning for Chicago to engage with my company in the enterprise contemplated by yourself and Colonel Thompson for the release of the Camp Douglas prisoners. Upon reaching Chicago, we found that already a strong force had been put into place by the Union Army, and veteran regiments were still arriving. One regiment was placed within Camp Douglas with the Confederates, and 16 pieces of artillery were parked, ready to open fire upon those defenseless men in case an attack was made. It required no great amount of perception to see that an attempt to accomplish our object would result not only in their indiscriminate slaughter, but our own certain death under the circumstances. Captains Hines and Castleman decided to make no effort in that direction. We waited until Wednesday night, hoping something would turn up by which we could benefit our suffering comrades and enhance the glory of the Confederacy. It was then determined to make an attempt upon the prison at Rock Island, if the Copperheads would furnish a small portion of the long-promised aid. When brought to the test, they could not furnish 50 men for the purpose. Hines then admitted that the thing was a failure, and the men, with few exceptions, decided to return to Canada.
And so large numbers of federal troops show up in Chicago on the eve of the Democratic Convention.
Journalist and author Julian Schur.
there's a huge sweep of arrests. The Sons of Liberty, who are really braggarts rather than really brave men, basically show up to the planning meetings and say they're not going to do anything. The Confederates are outraged at the timidity of the Sons of Liberty. So the insurrection falls apart. So do any of the attacks on the prisons. And so the final ploy in this three-pronged attack, the prisons fail, the insurrection fails, is the political coup.
With the military operation in Chicago a bust, the Copperhead leaders moved ahead with Plan B, to take over the Democratic Party and install Clement Vallandigham as the party's nominee to face Abraham Lincoln in November's presidential election. But once the voting at the Democratic Convention began, it became clear that there wasn't enough support for Vallandigham. So, the convention turned to former Union General George McClellan, who supported the war, but disagreed with Lincoln on almost everything else. With the candidate chosen, the only avenue for the Copperheads to assert their power was in the party platform. And their goal was to make sure that platform promoted peace with the Confederacy at any cost.
The Copperheads were strong enough to where they adopted a peace platform.
Mark Lowes is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Cincinnati.
That is, the position that they took when Lincoln was running for re-election was they wanted a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy. And of course, the only negotiated settlement you're going to get with the Confederacy is Southern independence. Of course, they nominated George B. McClellan as their candidate. And McClellan took the position that he was a Unionist. He was not an abolitionist. He didn't like the emancipation policy. He was a white supremacist, but he stood by the Union. So you had, in 1864, the Democrats nominating a candidate who had exactly the opposite position as the platform he was running on. That was an achievement of the Sons of Liberty.
Vallandigham had failed to pull off a grand uprising during the convention, and not a single Confederate prisoner had been freed. On the political front, he had failed in his bid to become the presidential nominee, and he had achieved only a symbolic victory in forcing the party to accept a peace platform. But, as he retreated to his new home in Canada, he was still the supreme commander of the Sons of Liberty, with tens of thousands of members throughout the Midwest. And he was still allied with a well-funded team of Confederate guerrillas, who were ready to pivot once again to a new strategy.
A young steps out, fires a gun in the air, and says, "In the name of the Confederate States, I am taking over this town."
That's next time on the Copperhead Conspiracy. The Copperhead Conspiracy is a production of Reckoning, Inc., with funding and scholarly assistance from Ohio Humanities. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Gettman. Our historical consultant was Dr. Stephen Rockenbach. Voice actors were Alec Voles and Barrett Cooper. Our theme music was composed by Ja'Cory Arthur, with other music licensed from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Nina Ellis, Louisville Public Media, and to Loretta Williams for editorial guidance. Major support for this series was provided by Archon Construction. Additional support from Jay and Susan Giles, Doreen Juha Sauer, Lopa Mehrotra, and Douglas and Marissa Brown. Many thanks to Julian Schur, Patrick Lewis, and Mark Lowes, whose interviews were heard in this episode. If you would like to support our nonprofit organization and unlock bonus episodes of this series, you can do so at patreon.com/reckoningradio. Our first bonus episode explains all the key events in American history that led to the Civil War. You can access that and more at patreon.com/reckoningradio. For transcripts, a bibliography, and other content related to this series, please visit our website at copperheadconspiracy.org. That's copperheadconspiracy.org. And if you haven't already done so, please leave a review of this series on whatever platform you use to hear it. It will really help other listeners to find this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Please join us next time for another episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy.